History Secrets.
We live in an era where wars are broadcast in real time. Images circulate across social media. Bombings, destruction, civilians running through rubble, and an inevitable question arises in the face of all this. What is really happening? In recent years, one of the most intense conflicts in the world has been concentrated in a small strip of territory in the Middle East. Gaza has become the stage for violence that shocks the entire planet. Videos appear daily. Destroyed buildings, entire families disappearing beneath the rubble. But some analysts raise a disturbing question. What if what we see on the surface does not fully explain what is happening? Before moving forward, it is important to understand a fundamental point. Throughout human history, wars have never been just wars. They have often carried symbolic, religious, or ritual meanings. Ancient civilizations frequently incorporated collective violence into practices considered sacred. A classic example comes from the Aztec civilization. Archaeological excavations have revealed temples containing thousands of human skulls. These remains were part of religious ceremonies intended to please deities and ensure prosperity for the empire. Another example appears among the Phoenicians, especially in ancient Carthage. Historical accounts describe rituals of child sacrifice associated with religious practices. Even civilizations considered pillars of Western culture also displayed similar practices. The Romans, for example, celebrated military victories with something called a triumph. During this ceremony, captured enemy leaders were publicly displayed through the streets of Rome. At the end of the ritual, these prisoners were executed in the Temple of Jupiter. It was a political spectacle, but it also carried deep religious symbolism: sacrifice, power, national unity. Faced with these historical examples, some observers begin to formulate an unsettling hypothesis. Could it be possible that certain modern conflicts also carry similar symbolic dimensions? This is a controversial interpretation raised by some contemporary analysts. According to this view, certain episodes of collective violence may function as mechanisms of social mobilization. Extreme events create fear, create outrage, but also create internal cohesion. A particularly controversial analysis applied to the current conflict suggests that some strategic decisions may be related to this kind of symbolic logic. According to this interpretation, certain military actions could generate a powerful psychological effect within the very society that carries them out. When a country sees itself surrounded by global criticism, its population tends to react in two ways: internal division, or absolute unity in the face of a common enemy. This dynamic appears repeatedly in military history. An ancient Chinese strategy illustrates this phenomenon well. Chinese generals sometimes positioned their own armies in front of a river. Behind the soldiers was the water. In front of them, the enemy. At that moment, the fighters realized there was no escape route. They either fought or died. With no alternative, most chose to fight with total intensity. The strategy became known as fighting with the river at your back. It transforms desperation into unity, and unity into strength. Some analysts see a psychological parallel in this logic. In certain circumstances, extremely shocking actions can create an environment where there is no longer space for neutrality. Society enters survival mode. Internal differences disappear. Everyone begins to fight for the same objective. This interpretation suggests that highly visible conflicts may generate exactly this effect. The greater the international condemnation, the greater the internal sense of sieging. And the greater the sense of siege, the greater the national unity. There is also a religious component that some scholars point out. Within extreme currents of Jewish eschatology, there is a belief that, at the end of times, Israel will face a great global coalition. According to this theological view, at that decisive moment, God would intervene to guarantee Israel's final victory. Some analysts speculate that radical ideological groups might interpret contemporary events as part of this historical process. This is a highly controversial hypothesis. but it appears in geopolitical and religious debates about the conflict. If this interpretation were correct, certain actions would not be only military, they would also be symbolic. They would create a narrative of siege, a narrative of historical destiny, a narrative that mobilizes an entire society. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this interpretation is not a consensus among historians or specialists. Many scholars see the conflict as the result of far more complex factors: territorial disputes, national security, internal politics, colonial history, religion, and deeply rooted regional rivalries. No single explanation can capture the full complexity of the conflict. But the question remains: why do certain conflicts seem to intensify even when the human cost is enormous? Why do strategic decisions sometimes appear to defy diplomatic logic? And why do episodes of extreme violence, instead of weakening societies, sometimes end up strengthening their internal cohesion? Perhaps the answer lies in the way human beings react to collective danger. History shows that deep crises often transform societies. They redefine identities, redefine alliances, and redefine the political future of entire nations. If some of these interpretations are correct, the events we are witnessing today may have consequences that we still cannot fully understand. Because throughout history, seemingly local conflicts have often triggered global transformations. And sometimes only decades later, do we understand the true meaning of what happened. The question, then, remains open. Are we observing just another chapter of a regional conflict? Or are we witnessing the beginning of something much larger? The hypothesis presented so far raises an unsettling possibility. What if certain violent events are not only consequences of conflict, but also political and psychological instruments? To understand this idea, it is necessary to observe how societies react in extreme situations. When a community perceives that it is surrounded by enemies, something profound happens within it. Internal divisions begin to disappear. Rival political groups suspend disputes. Internal criticism becomes dangerous. The priority becomes collective survival. This phenomenon is known by many historians as the cohesion effect under siege. It appears repeatedly throughout history. During World War II, for example, entire cities lived under constant bombardment. London was repeatedly hit during the German Blitz. Despite massive destruction, the result was not social collapse. It was the opposite. The British population became even more united. National identity strengthened. Resistance increased. Similar situations occurred in other wars. Bombings, sanctions, and external threats often produce an unexpected effect. Instead of dividing the population, they end up consolidating internal support for the government. Even criticized governments begin to be seen as defenders of national survival. This is one of the paradoxes of geopolitics. External pressure can strengthen what it intended to weaken. Applied to the current Middle East scenario, some analysts suggest that this psychological mechanism may be in action. According to this interpretation, the greater the international hostility toward Israel, the greater the tendency for internal unity within Israeli society. The logic is simple. If the country believes it faces an existential threat, political disagreements become secondary. Collective survival begins to dominate public debate. But there is a second element in this interpretation, an even more disturbing one: unity. Visibility. We live in an era in which every event is recorded by cameras. Every explosion can be filmed. Every attack can be shared instantly. This means that modern war takes place not only on the battlefield, it also takes place in the realm of global perception. Narratives become weapons. Images become political instruments. And international public opinion begins to influence strategic decisions. Some observers argue that, in certain cases, highly visible actions may serve to provoke predictable global reactions. Outrage, protests, international condemnation. All of this fuels a sense of global confrontation. This perception of confrontation can reinforce deep historical narratives within certain communities. Narratives of persecution, narratives of survival, narratives of collective destiny. When these narratives are activated, social mobilization can reach extraordinary levels. In the specific case of Israel, historical memory plays a fundamental role. For centuries, Jewish communities faced persecution in different parts of the world. This historical legacy deeply shaped Israeli national identity. The idea of existential security became central. For many Israelis, the survival of the state is seen as an absolute issue. Within this psychological context, external threats may be perceived not only as political challenges, but as existential risks. This completely alters how decisions are interpreted, and also changes how the population reacts. Another aspect raised by some analysts involves internal political radicalization. In virtually every country, deep crises tend to strengthen more extreme ideological groups. In moments of collective fear, moderate discourse often loses space. Harsher narratives gain popularity. Politics shifts. Language intensifies. This dynamic is not exclusive to any nation. It appears in various historical contexts. When societies enter a state of permanent mobilization, public debate changes. The priority is no longer consensus. The priority becomes victory. For this reason, understanding modern conflicts requires observing multiple layers at the same time. Military strategy, internal pressures, religion, historical memory, collective psychology, and also how the conflict is perceived by the world. The truth is that wars are rarely simple. They are complex systems. Systems in which political decisions, religious beliefs, strategic interests, and collective emotions intertwine. It is at this point that controversial interpretations begin to emerge. Some observers believe that certain events can only be understood when analyzed within these multiple layers. Others completely reject these interpretations and argue that the conflict should be explained by traditional political factors. Perhaps both perspectives reveal different parts of the same reality. History often shows that human conflicts have more than one cause, more than one narrative, more than one interpretation. What makes the current moment particularly delicate is the speed at which events unfold. Events that once took months to spread now reach the entire planet in minutes. War has become global, not only because of its military impact, but because of its informational impact. Each new episode generates waves of reaction around the world. Protests, political debates, diplomatic pressure, social movements, and these reactions, in turn, feed back into the conflict itself, creating a cycle that is difficult to interrupt. If there is one recurring lesson in the history of wars, it is this. Conflicts rarely remain confined to the place where they began. They tend to expand. They tend to pull in new forces, new interests, new actors. The question that remains, then, is deeply unsettling. Are we observing just another chapter of a prolonged regional conflict? Or are we facing a process that could redefine the global balance in the coming decades? Throughout history, seemingly local conflicts have already triggered global transformations. In 1914, for example, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo seemed like a regional event. But within a few weeks, military alliances were activated. The result was World War I. Millions dead. Empires destroyed. A new political map for the planet. Historical events rarely reveal their true scale immediately. Often, what seems like an isolated episode becomes part of a much larger chain of events. That is why geopolitical analysts observe certain conflicts so closely. They look for patterns, connections, signals of escalation. In the case of the Middle East, the complexity is even greater. The region lies at the crossroads of 3 continents. There, strategic interests from various powers converge. Energy resources, trade routes, and also a vast concentration of religious significance. Jerusalem, for example, is considered sacred by three major religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. This convergence makes every conflict in the region particularly sensitive. At the same time, the international system is undergoing a moment of transformation. The global order established after World War II faces increasing pressure. New powers emerge. Old alliances are questioned. Competition between geopolitical blocs intensifies. Within this context, regional crises can quickly acquire global dimensions. Some analysts believe that the current conflict is part of this historical transition. According to this view, we are entering a new phase of international politics, a phase marked by instability, strategic competition, and disputes for influence. In such scenarios, local conflicts often become arenas where global interests confront each other. Powerful countries support different sides. International organizations attempt to intervene. Diplomacy comes into play, but it does not always succeed in preventing escalation. Another important factor is the impact of narratives. In modern wars, controlling the narrative has become almost as important as controlling territory. Governments, political movements, and even individuals on social media participate in this dispute. Each side seeks to present its version of events. Each side tries to mobilize international support. This creates an extremely complex informational environment. Images can be interpreted in different ways. Political speeches can reinforce perceptions of threat, and global public opinion begins to influence diplomatic decisions. In many cases, prolonged conflicts produce an additional effect: the normalization of crisis. Over time, events that initially shock the world begin to be seen as part of routine. This creates a dangerous risk. Violence becomes banal. Outrage loses intensity, and diplomatic solutions become even more difficult. Despite all this, history also shows another important pattern. Seemingly unsolvable conflicts sometimes find unexpected paths to resolution. Former enemies become partners. Peace agreements emerge after decades of hostility. Societies tired of war seek new paths. None of this happens quickly. Historical processes are slow, complex, full of advances and setbacks, but they show that the future is never completely determined. That is precisely why understanding present conflicts is so important, not only to analyze what is happening now, but to understand which paths may open in the future. If some of the interpretations discussed in this documentary have any validity, then we are facing a decisive moment, a moment in which political decisions, ideological narratives, and social reactions may shape the next chapter of global history. If they are mistaken, they still reveal something essential. They reveal how societies try to make sense of complex events. They reveal how human beings seek patterns amid chaos. And they reveal how narratives influence the way we see the world. Perhaps the most important question is not only what is happening now, but what these interpretations say about us, about our fears, our beliefs, and our attempts to understand history while it is still being written. Because, in the end, conflicts are not only confrontations between territories, they are also confrontations between ideas, between worldviews, between different interpretations of reality. And as long as these interpretations continue to exist, the debate about the true meaning of these events will remain open, perhaps for decades, perhaps for generations. History is not finished yet, and the next chapters may reveal far more than we imagine. Many civilizations flourished before ours. Some dominated vast territories. Others disappeared almost without leaving traces. What remains are clues, scattered through time, silent monuments, fragmented manuscripts, stories passed down through generations. Each discovery brings us a little closer to the truth. But history still holds many secrets. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
There comes a moment when a society stops evolving, yet still doesn't realize it has already begun to collapse. It continues to function, institutions still exist, speeches are still being made, indicators still seem acceptable, but something invisible begins to fall apart from within. Cohesion weakens, trust dissolves, and slowly, the system loses its ability to sustain itself. What we will see here is not an absolute prediction. It is a possible reading, built from historical patterns, social dynamics, and political decisions accumulated over time. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part is this: collapse rarely comes from the outside. It is born from within. The narrative begins with a concrete example: a country that for a long time was seen as a symbol of stability, prosperity, and quality of life. A country that seemed to have found a rare balance between wealth, security, and well-being. But that balance began to strain. In recent years, structural changes began to accumulate. Accelerated population growth, driven by intense migration flows, concentrated millions of people in a few urban centers. This generated a chain reaction. Housing prices soared. The cost of living increased continuously. Pressure on public services intensified. At the same time, wages did not keep up with this pace. The result was an unstable equation. Working was no longer enough to guarantee basic security. In some cities, it became almost impossible to survive without an income far above average. And when a society reaches this point, the consequences begin to appear. Crime increases. The homeless population grows. Addiction spreads as a symptom, not as a cause. But here a central question emerges. It is easy to point to visible culprits: immigrants, foreigners, new social groups. Those who arrived more recently become the immediate target of collective frustration. After all, they are the ones who appear in everyday life, in queues, in the streets, in statistics. But this explanation is superficial. It ignores deeper layers of the structure. The very experience of those living through this process reveals another dimension. The story of a family that arrived decades earlier seeking a better life shows an important contrast to us. They came from a context of extreme poverty, an environment where even basic items were considered a luxury. Migration represented not only an economic opportunity, but an escape from a reality almost unimaginable by today's standards. And at first, there was gratitude. But there was also difficulty. Hard work, precarious jobs, silent discrimination, cultural barriers. The promise of upward mobility existed, but it was not automatic. It required extreme effort, constant adaptation, and often, the acceptance of conditions that few would willingly accept. Even so, there was a fundamental difference. At that moment, the system was still able to absorb these trajectories. There was room for mobility. There was margin for growth. Over time, that margin began to disappear. And this is where the analysis changes direction. The problem is not only who enters the system, it is how the system is structured to deal with it. To understand this dynamic, it is necessary to observe the incentives that sustain political decisions. Behind public policies, there is always a logic of maintaining balance. But this balance is not neutral. It serves specific interests, often invisible to those observing from the outside. One generation in particular occupies a central position in this scenario. A generation that accumulated wealth, stability, and power over decades. One that grew up during a period of economic expansion, geopolitical security, and continuous growth. This generation came to depend on three fundamental pillars: the maintenance of their pensions, access to a broad and functional healthcare system, the continuous appreciation of their assets, especially real estate. To sustain these three pillars, the economy needs to keep growing. And for the economy to grow, there are few structural alternatives. To exploit natural resources more intensively, to stimulate innovation and entrepreneurship on a large scale, or to increase the economically active population. Each of these options has costs. Resource exploitation conflicts with environmental values. Encouraging entrepreneurship requires reducing state control and accepting greater risk. Immigration, in turn, offers a more immediate solution. It injects labor, increases consumption, sustains short-term growth, but it also creates pressure, and this pressure is not distributed equally. While some benefit directly, others absorb the costs. This asymmetry generates social tension, and when this tension does not find a clear explanation, it seeks simple targets. This is the point where conspiratorial narratives emerge. Theories that attempt to explain the phenomenon as the result of hidden plans, global coordination, or deliberate intentions of cultural destruction. But there is an alternative reading. Perhaps the system is not being guided by a higher intelligence. Perhaps it is being driven by fragmented decisions, immediate interests, and a collective inability to deal with long-term consequences. This possibility is less comfortable, because it eliminates the idea of central control and forces us to consider something more difficult. The hypothesis that collapse is not planned. It is emergent, the result of rational choices in the short term that become destructive in the long term. To understand this more deeply, it is necessary to look at the broader structure, not just of a specific country, but of an entire model of society. A society built on relative abundance, prolonged security, and the absence of significant external threats. When a system operates for a long time without major disruptions, it tends to develop specific characteristics. It becomes more regulated, more predictable, more dependent on stability. But this stability has a price. It reduces adaptability. And by reducing adaptability, the system becomes vulnerable to slow, yet continuous changes. Changes that are not perceived as immediate crises, but that, when accumulated, completely transform the structure. In this context, collective identity also transforms. It ceases to be based on clear shared objectives and becomes sustained by abstract values, social norms, and institutional structures. This may work for a while, but under pressure, these structures begin to reveal fragilities, and when that happens, society enters a peculiar state. It still functions, but it no longer knows exactly why. Then, an inevitable question arises. What exactly keeps a society united when it no longer has a clear common purpose? During long periods of stability, many nations stop being guided by a concrete mission and begin to sustain themselves through more subtle mechanisms. Shared values, implicit norms, behaviors learned since childhood. But these elements, although powerful, are not indestructible. They depend on something invisible. Trust. Trust that the rules make sense. Trust that effort will be rewarded. Trust that the system, despite its imperfections, still works. When this trust begins to deteriorate, something changes profoundly. And what is most curious is that this change does not happen abruptly. It is silent, almost imperceptible at first. People continue working, studying, paying bills, following their routines. But internally, their relationship with the system is no longer the same. A distance emerges, a constant doubt. And over time, this doubt transforms into behavior. Rules begin to be followed not out of conviction, but out of convenience. Cooperation gives way to caution. Empathy begins to be replaced by distrust. This is a critical point, because a society does not collapse only when it lacks food, money, or security. It collapses when it loses its capacity for spontaneous cooperation. And this capacity is directly linked to the perception of justice. If the system begins to seem unfair, even if it still functions, people start to act defensively. They compete more, trust less, protect only their own interests. And this creates a cascading effect. Now, to understand why this process intensifies, we need to observe a specific characteristic of this social model: the absence of collective ambition. In some historical contexts, ambition was the engine of transformation. It drove innovation, expansion, and development. But there is a paradox. When a society reaches a high level of comfort and security, ambition ceases to be valued. It starts to be viewed with suspicion, as something aggressive, unnecessary, even undesirable. In this environment, a culture of moderation emerges. Avoid risks. Avoid conflicts. Avoid abrupt changes. At first glance, this seems positive. But in the long term, it creates a structural problem. Without ambition, there is no renewal. Without renewal, there is no adaptation. And without adaptation, any external change, no matter how small, begins to generate disproportionate impact. This pattern can be observed in different aspects of collective behavior. A growing tendency toward obedience. People begin to trust excessively in authorities, experts, and institutions, not through critical analysis but by habit. Following rules becomes more important than questioning them. Another characteristic is the constant need to avoid conflict. In a highly diverse society, avoiding offending others becomes a priority. This creates an additional layer of self-censorship. People stop expressing opinions not because they changed their minds, but because they prefer not to generate friction. And finally, something more subtle emerges: the normalization of mediocrity. Not in the sense of incapacity, but in the sense of the absence of a pursuit of excellence. If no one should stand out too much, if ambition is seen as something negative, then the average standard becomes the ideal. This stabilizes the system for a while, but it also limits it, because it eliminates the extremes that usually drive transformation. And here an interesting contrast appears. Theoretically, a society with a high level of wealth, security, and free time would have ideal conditions to generate innovation, deep thinking, and meaningful contributions to humanity. But in practice, that does not always happen. Instead, the system can enter a state of complacency. People settle. Critical thinking decreases. The search for meaning is replaced by comfort. And little by little, collective potential ceases to be explored. At this point, the analysis connects to an even broader dimension: the relationship between generations. There is a specific generation that grew up in a completely different context. A period of economic expansion, continuous growth, and progressive improvement in quality of life. This generation learned that the world works in a certain way, that progress is guaranteed, that growth is natural, that the system will always find a solution. But the problem is that these assumptions are not eternal. They depend on specific conditions. And when those conditions change, learned behavior begins to produce unexpected effects. This generation accumulated power, economic power, political power, cultural power, and with that, it began to directly influence the decisions that shape the system. But there is an implicit conflict. Maintaining this generation's standard of living requires continuous growth, and this growth, in an already saturated environment, needs to be sustained by increasingly artificial mechanisms. One of these mechanisms is population expansion through immigration. Another is the constant appreciation of assets, such as real estate. Another is the expansion of public systems that depend on an ever-growing base of contributors. In the short term, these solutions work, but in the long term, they generate imbalances. And these imbalances fall mainly on younger generations, who face a completely different scenario. Fewer opportunities, more competition, more uncertainty, and, perhaps most importantly, less prospect of upward mobility. This deeply alters behavior. Young people begin to postpone important decisions, avoid long-term commitments, question the value of following the traditional path. And one of the most visible consequences of this is the decline in birth rates. But this decline is not only economic, it is psychological. It reflects a perception of an uncertain future. And when a society loses confidence in the future, it begins to enter a state of contraction. Less investment, less risk, less building, more preservation, more caution, more isolation. This movement, although understandable, accelerates the very process of stagnation, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. There is an experiment that helps illustrate this type of dynamic in an almost disturbing way. In the 1960s, social scientist John B. Calhoun conducted a series of studies that became known as the Mouse Utopia. The proposal was simple, but radical: to create an environment where there was no scarcity, abundant water, unlimited food, total absence of predators, controlled temperature, Sufficient space. In theory, this would be the ideal scenario for a society to thrive. But what happened was exactly the opposite. At first, the population grew rapidly. Resources were abundant, and there were no apparent reasons for conflict. Everything seemed to function perfectly. But over time, something began to change. Social structures began to deteriorate. Hierarchies stopped functioning. Behavior patterns became erratic. Cooperation disappeared. Individuals began to exhibit extreme behaviors. Gratuitous violence. Aggression without purpose. Social isolation. Collapse of relationships. And eventually, the population entered into decline. Even with unlimited resources. Even without external threats. The society collapsed due to internal causes. Calhoun called this phenomenon behavioral sink. And to this day, this experiment continues to be debated, because it raises an uncomfortable hypothesis. Perhaps abundance alone is not enough to sustain a healthy society. Perhaps there is an invisible limit, a point at which the absence of challenges begins to erode the very structure of society. If we connect this idea to the current scenario, a possible interpretation emerges. We are living in a period where many of the historical limitations have been reduced or eliminated. Extreme scarcity, which shaped much of human history, is no longer the dominant factor in many regions of the world. But this has not eliminated competition. It has only transformed it, because there is something that cannot be distributed infinitely. Status, recognition, power, social position. These elements remain limited. And when a society produces more individuals seeking status than there are positions available, a phenomenon known as elite overproduction emerges. More and more qualified people, more and more competition, less and less space. And when there is no outlet for this pressure, conflict intensifies, not necessarily in a physical way, but psychologically, socially, culturally. Disputes stop being external and become internal. Groups compete with each other. Narratives collide. Polarization increases. And in this environment, cooperation becomes even more difficult. This context helps explain a behavior that has become increasingly common: the refusal to invest in the future. Not only financially, but existentially. The decision not to have children, for example, can be seen from a new perspective. It is not just an economic issue. It is a response to an environment perceived as unstable. If the future seems uncertain, if opportunities seem limited, if competition seems excessive, then the natural impulse of continuity begins to weaken. And this creates an even deeper effect. Because a society that stops reproducing, not only biologically, but also culturally, begins to lose its historical continuity. It begins to exist in the present, without a clear projection of the future. And this completely changes the way decisions are made. The short term begins to dominate. The long term loses relevance. And when this happens, the solutions adopted tend to become increasingly immediate. Now, there is an additional element that intensifies this process: the relationship with power. In many contexts, especially in the Western world, there is a significant concentration of power in the hands of a specific generation. A generation that, as we have seen, accumulated wealth, stability, and influence over decades. But there is an important detail. This generation not only accumulated power, it is also living longer than any previous generation. Advances in medicine, access to advanced healthcare systems, and improvements in living conditions have significantly extended life expectancy. This creates an unprecedented situation. Power remains concentrated for longer. And this reduces the speed of system renewal. New ideas take longer to emerge. New leadership faces more barriers. New structures struggle to establish themselves. And at the same time, this generation has clear incentives to keep the system as it is, because the current system sustains its standard of living. This is not necessarily the result of bad intention, but of aligned interests, maintaining stability, avoiding radical changes, protecting what has been achieved. The problem is that, in a changing environment, the absence of change also becomes a risk, because the external world continues to evolve. and a system that does not adapt inevitably loses competitiveness. At this point, the analysis reaches a more symbolic dimension. The idea of empire. Historically, empires do not collapse only due to external attacks. Many times, the process begins internally. Excessive confidence, overexpansion, disconnection between leadership and reality, and, perhaps most importantly, the inability to recognize one's own limits. There is a powerful image that can help understand this. The image of a force that, in seeking to assert its own greatness, ends up destroying what sustains its existence. A dynamic where the pursuit of power turns into self-sabotage. And, in this context, an unsettling hypothesis emerges. That systems can continue operating even when they are already compromised. They can continue expanding, even when that expansion is no longer sustainable. They can continue making decisions that seem rational in the short term, but that, in the long term, accelerate their own collapse. Faced with all of this, an inevitable question arises. What can be done? And perhaps, this is the most difficult part. Because when a system reaches this level of complexity, solutions are no longer simple. There is no single action that can reverse the process. There is no central point that can be adjusted to fix everything. And more than that, there is a fundamental human factor. The people who sustain this system are not abstract. They are fathers, mothers, family members, individuals who built their lives within this structure. And this creates a dilemma. Because any significant change implies cost. And that cost is not only economic. It is emotional. It is social. It is existential. That is why, many times the system continues. Not because it works perfectly, but because changing it seems even more risky. Perhaps the most uncomfortable point of this entire analysis is not in the data, nor in the models, nor in historical comparisons. It is in responsibility. Because, throughout this entire process, there's a constant tendency to search for external culprits, a visible enemy, an organized force, an explanation that simplifies complexity. But this search, most of the time, serves more as relief than as understanding. It displaces the problem. And by displacing the problem, it prevents it from truly being faced. When we look more closely, we realize that many of the dynamics that lead to collapse are not imposed from outside. They emerge from within. They are the result of accumulated decisions, misaligned incentives and behaviors that, individually, seem rational, but that, collectively, produce unexpected consequences. This does not mean that there is a single responsible party. It means that the system as a whole participates in this process. And that includes all levels: institutions, governments, markets, individuals. Each small decision, each daily choice, each adaptation made to deal with the present contributes, in some way, to shaping the future. And that is precisely why the idea of "there is nothing to be done" can be misleading. Not because there are easy solutions, but because there is at least a starting point. Awareness, recognizing patterns, identifying dynamics, understanding consequences. Without this, any attempt at change becomes superficial. There is a phrase implicit throughout this entire reflection: that truth, in itself, has value, even if it does not immediately solve the problem, even if it does not bring comfort, even if it does not offer clear hope. Speaking the truth in this context is not an act of denunciation. It is an act of responsibility toward future generations, toward those who will still live through the consequences of these decisions. Because if there is one thing that history repeatedly shows, it is that societies that cannot recognize their own flaws tend to repeat them, and often in a more intense way. But there is also another possible reading, less deterministic, less fatalistic. That collapse, when it occurs, is not only destruction, it is also transformation. Systems that become unsustainable eventually give way to new structures, new forms of organization, new ideas, new values. The problem is that this process is not linear, nor painless. It involves rupture, uncertainty, reconfiguration, And during this period, the predominant feeling is not renewal. It is loss. Perhaps, then the question needs to be reframed. Not only how to avoid collapse, but how to go through this process with the lowest possible level of destruction. And this question does not have a single answer, but it points in a direction. The need for reconstruction. Reconstruction of trust. Reconstruction of purpose. Reconstruction of cooperation. Elements that cannot be imposed. They need to be rebuilt gradually, and often, locally, on small scales, in communities, in direct relationships, in spaces where it is still possible to establish real bonds. Because in complex systems, major changes rarely begin at the top. They emerge at the edges. In the end, perhaps the scenario presented here is not a definitive sentence, but an invitation to more careful observation, to deeper reflection, and above all, to the willingness to face the discomfort that comes with understanding. Because understanding is the first step, even when acting is not yet possible, even when the answers are still not clear. And perhaps it is precisely there that everything begins. Throughout history, many events have been recorded, but others have disappeared over time. Lost manuscripts, forgotten accounts, evidence that never reached us. But this raises an inevitable question. How many truths of history do we really know? Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
There's something deeply wrong happening in the world. And you may already be feeling it, even if you can't quite explain it. The numbers don't lie, but the way they are presented almost always hides what truly matters. For nearly 200 years, a nation grew with relative stability. Debt existed, but it was manageable. It was part of the game. Then, something changed. Almost imperceptibly at first, and then explosively, debt began to grow without stopping. Today, it hasn't just increased. It has completely spiraled out of control. We are talking about tens of trillions of dollars accumulated by a single government. And that is only the surface. Because behind this public debt, there is another even more unsettling layer. Ordinary people are also in debt. Credit cards, loans, mortgages. When you add everything up, the total is equally colossal. And the inevitable question arises, almost like an uncomfortable whisper. Who, in fact, is going to pay this bill? The answer may be more disturbing than it seems, because in many cases, this debt will simply never be paid. It will be pushed forward, diluted, redistributed, until it disappears in the form of inflation, loss of purchasing power, and a silent deterioration of quality of life. And this is just one of the signs. In parallel, something more subtle, and perhaps more dangerous, begins to happen. The middle class, historically the pillar of stability in any society, starts to disappear. Not abruptly, but like a constant erosion. Small losses, accumulated over time, until the entire structure becomes fragile. At the same time, another phenomenon emerges. People simply stop having children. Not because of a lack of biological capacity, but because of a lack of perspective. The future no longer feels like a safe place to invest a new life. And when a society stops reproducing, it doesn't just age. It enters a silent process of contraction. This pattern is not isolated. It repeats itself across various countries in the so-called Western world. Housing prices rise to inaccessible levels. Inflation slowly erodes daily life. Economic growth seems to exist only on charts, while concrete reality becomes more difficult. Inequality increases. not just as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Some people accumulate assets, others accumulate debt. And in the middle of all this, the system continues to function, at least on the surface. But when a system keeps operating, even when its foundations are deteriorating, it raises an inevitable question. Are we facing a failure or a design? This question opens the door to multiple interpretations. One of the most well-known explanations is so-called neoliberalism. The idea that everything should be guided by economic growth though. If the economy grows, everything gets resolved. If the numbers are positive, the system is healthy. But this logic assumes something fundamental. That economic growth automatically translates into collective well-being. And that does not always happen. Another interpretation points to the rise of large technological corporations, an unprecedented concentration of power. Companies that not only dominate markets, but influence behaviors, decisions, and even perceptions of reality. Within this perspective, a more unsettling hypothesis emerges. What if the objective is not just growth, but control? Because when you don't own a house, don't own assets, and depend entirely on external systems to survive, your margin of autonomy shrinks drastically. There is also the idea of a global reorganization, a more centralized system where borders lose importance and decisions begin to be made at supranational levels. And, in parallel, even more controversial theories appear, such as population replacement. The hypothesis that certain populations are being gradually replaced by others, considered easier to manage. These ideas circulate, gain traction in certain groups, and are rejected in others. And it is important to maintain a clear distinction. They are interpretations, not necessarily facts. But perhaps there is a more direct, and less ideological, way to analyze all of this. Whenever you observe a large-scale structural change, there is a question that can brutally simplify the analysis. Who benefits? This question cuts through layers of discourse and goes straight to the point. Because systems, in the end, tend to favor certain groups. If housing prices are constantly rising, someone is benefiting from it. If the financial market grows while real income stagnates, there is a group being favored. And when you start connecting these points, a pattern begins to emerge. It is not immediate. It is not obvious. But gradually, it becomes hard to ignore. There is a specific group that seems to be in an extremely favorable position within these transformations. A group that benefits from asset appreciation. That does not depend directly on the growth of productive labor. That is not affected in the same way by inflation in everyday life. And that at the same time holds significant political and economic influence. From this point on, the analysis stops being purely economic and becomes structural. Because perhaps what we are observing is not just a crisis. Perhaps it is a silent reorganization. There is a detail that completely changes how you interpret all of this, and it is almost never discussed directly. We are not dealing only with economics. We are not dealing only with politics. We are dealing with a structural shift in the very composition of society. Never, in all of human history, has there been such a large number of elderly people, and more importantly, such a large number of elderly people with accumulated wealth. This is not a trivial phenomenon. It completely alters the balance of power within a system, because, unlike other times, these people have not only lived longer, they have accumulated assets over decades. Real estate, stocks, funds, properties. And these assets continue to appreciate. At the same time, younger generations enter the system in a completely different position. More indebted, with less access to assets, and facing much higher living costs. This creates an asymmetry. And this asymmetry, when combined with the demographic factor, begins to produce consequences that go far beyond economics. Because, in any democratic society, those who have more presence have more influence. And when you have a growing population of elderly people, with high political participation, high levels of wealth, and a strong interest in maintaining stability, You begin to shape collective decisions based on those interests. From this point on, many of the trends that seem disconnected begin to make sense. High housing prices stop being a problem and become an advantage for those who already own property. Inflated financial markets stop being a worrying bubble and become a continuous source of appreciation for those who are already inside. Inflation, in many cases, does not affect in the same way those who have already accumulated enough wealth to absorb these variations. But there is an even more delicate element: the retirement system. For decades, these systems were built on two fundamental assumptions. The first, people would retire and live only a few years after that. The second, investments would grow in a relatively predictable way over time. Neither of these assumptions holds anymore. People are not dying at the expected rate. They are living longer, much longer, and financial markets are not stable. They fluctuate. They rise, fall, generate gains, and losses. This creates enormous pressure on pension funds, because in simple terms, there are more people withdrawing money than people putting money into the system. This is the kind of problem that does not appear immediately. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, until it reaches a critical point, and when that point arrives, there is no smooth adjustment. There is rupture. At the same time, another imbalance emerges. The ratio between workers and retirees begins to invert. For a long time, the system worked under a simple logic: many workers supporting a smaller number of retirees. But now, that ratio is changing. Fewer workers, more retirees. And this is not just a statistical detail, it completely redefines the sustainability of the system. Because, ultimately, someone has to produce, someone has to generate real wealth. And when the productive base shrinks while the demand for resources increases, tension becomes inevitable. This is the point where the analysis stops being comfortable, because it is no longer just about numbers. It is about conflict of interests. On one side, a generation that accumulated wealth lives longer and wants to preserve its benefits. On the other, a generation that enters the system with fewer resources, more debt, and fewer prospects. And when these interests collide, the system needs to make decisions. Not always explicit, not always declared, but decisions that, in practice, favor one side more than the other. This is the moment when a concept emerges that, although rarely discussed, explains much of what we are seeing: gerontocracy. A system where power, political, economic, and institutional, is concentrated in the hands of older individuals. This does not necessarily mean that these individuals are incompetent, nor that they lack merit, but it does mean that their priorities are different, and priorities shape decisions. Young people tend to seek change, experimentation, transformation. Adults tend to seek balance, controlled growth, progressive stability, but the elderly tend to seek security, and security, when taken to the extreme, turns into resistance to change. This explains why entire systems begin to become more rigid, slower, more resistant to any kind of structural transformation, because any change represents risk. And risk, for those who have already accumulated a lot, is something to be avoided at any cost. This starts to reflect in public policies, in economic decisions, and even in the way society deals with individual freedom. Because, in an environment where the priority is security, control becomes a legitimate tool. More surveillance, more regulation, more interference in everyday life. Not always in an aggressive way, often in a gradual way, almost imperceptible, but constant. And when you observe this pattern over time, you realize that it is not about isolated events. It is about a direction. A direction that, slowly, reshapes how society functions. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question is not whether this is happening, but how far this can go. If you take this logic to its ultimate consequences, something starts to become clear, and it is not comfortable. When a society becomes dominated by a structure focused almost exclusively on security, stability, and preservation of wealth, collective behavior begins to change, and not in a subtle way. The first transformation happens in freedom, not necessarily through explicit repression, but through small concessions, seemingly reasonable adjustments, measures justified by protection, health, order, or well-being. Each one of them, in isolation, seems acceptable, but the whole tells another story. Surveillance increases. Technologies that were once tools begin to become mechanisms of constant monitoring. What you do, where you go, who you talk to, what you consume. Everything can be recorded, everything can be analyzed, and eventually, everything can be controlled. But this control does not come with the appearance of oppression. It comes with the appearance of convenience, more security, more practicality, more efficiency. And this is the point where most people fail to realize what is happening. Because when control presents itself as a benefit, it does not encounter resistance. It is accepted. It is integrated. It becomes part of everyday life. And by the time you realize it, you are already inside a system where leaving it is no longer a simple choice. Another element begins to emerge strongly: financial control. Cash has always represented a form of autonomy, a way to carry out transactions outside centralized systems, a margin of freedom. But this begins to change. The full digitalization of transactions creates an environment where every financial movement can be tracked, analyzed, and, if necessary, limited. It is not just about knowing what you buy, but about being able to decide what you are allowed to buy. This is a type of power that is extremely subtle and extremely powerful, because it does not need to stop you directly. It simply redefines the limits within which you can act, and within those limits you still believe you are choosing freely. Another point begins to emerge within this scenario: the reorganization of the workforce. If there's an aging population with a high concentration of wealth and a growing need for services, then a specific demand arises: caregivers, nurses, operational workers, people willing to perform tasks that are often undervalued, but essential. And if the local population does not want or cannot take on these roles, the solution becomes almost automatic: import labor. This leads to a significant increase in immigration, not necessarily for humanitarian reasons, but for structural necessity. The system needs young people. It needs workers. It needs support. And this creates a complex dynamic. Because at the same time it solves an immediate problem, it also generates social, cultural, and economic tensions. But within the logic of the system, this is secondary. The main objective is to keep the structure functioning, and any measure that contributes to that tends to be adopted. Even if the side effects are significant, there is also a more delicate aspect: the relationship with direct social control. When the highest priority is security, any behavior considered outside the norm begins to be seen as a risk, and risks need to be controlled. This can translate into more laws, more regulations, more state presence in areas that were once private, not necessarily with violence, but with constant authority. Everyday life begins to be shaped by increasingly detailed rules. What can be said, what can be done, how you should behave, and, little by little, the margin of spontaneity shrinks. Not all at once, but progressively, until the very idea of freedom begins to be reinterpreted. Freedom ceases to be the absence of control, and begins to be defined as conformity within a safe system. And this shift is profound, because it does not only change behaviors, it changes perceptions, it changes values, it changes the way people understand the world. And perhaps the most unsettling point is this: This process does not require a centralized plan. It does not require a coordinated conspiracy. It can emerge naturally from the right incentives, from dominant priorities, from the demographic structure. When you combine population, aging, concentration of wealth, pressure on pension systems, need for stability, and fear of loss, the result tends to follow a predictable direction. More control, more rigidity, more preservation, less change. And this leads us to an inevitable question. If this system continues evolving in this direction, what happens to the next generations? If there is a point where all of this converges, it is here. The future is not just being postponed, it is being redistributed. Every decision made today, economic, political, or social, does not affect everyone in the same way. Some consequences are immediate, others are pushed forward. And, almost always, those who pay the highest price still do not have enough power to prevent it. Younger generations enter a system where the assets have already been acquired, where prices have already risen, where opportunities have already been partially captured. They do not start from zero. They start at a disadvantage, with more debt, with more competition, with less margin for error. And at the same time, these same generations are the ones who need to sustain the entire structure. Work, produce, pay taxes, finance systems that, possibly, will not be available to them in the future. This is the kind of misalignment that does not explode immediately. It accumulates, silently, until it begins to appear in forms that seem disconnected. Demotivation, anxiety, lack of perspective, refusal to follow the traditional path, fewer marriages, fewer children, less commitment to long-term structures. Because at some level, there's an intuitive perception that the social contract has been altered. Not officially, but in practice. The implicit promise that effort leads to stability begins to unravel. And when that promise loses credibility, collective behavior changes. People start playing a different game, a shorter game, more immediate, less based on long-term building, and more based on survival in the present. This is not necessarily a conscious choice. It is an adaptation. At the same time, the system continues to demand commitment, discipline, productivity, but offers less and less real security in return. And this tension begins to grow. There is also a deeper and less visible consequence. The change in the relationship with the very meaning of life. When the future no longer seems promising, the present becomes heavy. When effort does not guarantee return, motivation weakens. And when the structure loses coherence, the individual begins to disconnect from it. This creates a kind of emptiness, not necessarily material, but existential. A diffuse feeling that something is not right, even when everything seems functional on the surface. And this type of emptiness cannot be solved only with economic policies. It requires something deeper. But the system, focused on stability and control, rarely addresses this dimension. So, what happens? People begin to search for alternatives. New ways of living, new ways of working, new ways of relating to the world. Some of these alternatives are constructive, others are destructive. But all of them share a common origin, the attempt to recover some degree of autonomy. Because, in the end, that is what is being gradually reduced. Autonomy, real capacity of choice, the ability to build something of your own without completely depending on external structures. And when this capacity decreases, the reaction is not uniform. Some adapt, some resist, some simply disconnect. But the system keeps advancing. The structural logic does not stop. It does not wait for consensus. It does not ask for permission. It follows the incentives. And the incentives, at this moment, point toward the continuation of this model. More concentration, more control, more dependence, less margin for deviation. And this brings us to the final point of this analysis, not as a definitive conclusion, but as an inevitable reflection. If all of this is not the result of a single cause, if there is no single responsible agent, if it is just the natural consequence of multiple factors combining, then the question changes completely. It is no longer, who is doing this? But rather, why is no one stopping it? And perhaps the answer is the most uncomfortable of all, because to stop it, it would be necessary to change the system. And changing the system means threatening exactly those who benefit the most from it. And when those who hold power have no incentive to change, change does not happen. At least, not gradually. There is a point where all these lines of analysis intersect, and it is not in the data, nor in the theories. It is in the consequence. Because regardless of the cause, whether incompetence, economic incentives, demographic structure, or simple inertia, the result begins to manifest in a concrete way, and results cannot be ignored forever. Systems do not collapse suddenly. They wear down. They become less efficient, less responsive, heavier, slower, until, at some point, they stop functioning as expected. And when that happens, there are only two possible paths: adaptation or rupture. Adaptation requires awareness. It requires recognizing the problem. It requires willingness to change deeply rooted structures. But this type of change rarely comes from those who are comfortable. Rupture, on the other hand, does not require planning. It happens when accumulated pressure exceeds the system's capacity to sustain itself. And when that occurs, it is not controlled. It is not predictable. It is not smooth. The question, then, is no longer whether the system is fair or unfair. It becomes, is it sustainable? Because a system can function for a long time, even while being imperfect. But no system functions indefinitely when its own foundations are being eroded. And perhaps the clearest sign of this is not in charts, nor in policies, but in people's behavior, in the loss of trust, in the reduction of engagement, in the growing feeling that the game is already decided, before it even begins. This is the kind of perception that does not appear in reports, but that, when it spreads, completely changes the dynamics of a society, because systems depend on participation. They depend on belief. They depend on collective acceptance. And when that acceptance begins to weaken, the system continues to exist, but it loses legitimacy. And a system without legitimacy can continue operating for a while, but not indefinitely. It is at this point that the analysis needs to stop looking only at structures and start looking at choices. Not only the choices of governments, but individual choices. How do you respond to this scenario? Do you ignore it? Do you adapt? Do you try to exit the game? Or do you try to understand it deeply in order to act more consciously within it? There is no single answer, because each position within the system offers different possibilities. But there is one constant. Ignoring it does not prevent the system from continuing to evolve. And perhaps, this is the most important reflection. You may not control the system, but You can choose how to position yourself within it. You can choose what to build. You can choose what to believe. You can choose how far to comply and how far to resist. And in a scenario where structures are becoming increasingly rigid, this may be the only real form of freedom that still remains. Because, in the end, the question was never only about economics. It was never only about politics. It was never only about generations. It is about direction, about where all of this is leading, and about how much time is still left before that direction becomes irreversible. Perhaps there is no definitive answer, but there is something that can no longer be ignored. Something has changed, and it continues to change, silently, constantly, and now, inevitably. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.